Hello, welcome to the Media Club. I'm your host, Matt Deegan. In the club today, World of Wonder co-founder Fenton Bailey on the rise of RuPaul's Drag Race, the joys of forming an indie in the 90s and taking on the Church of England. Also on the programme, unfinished business at the BBC with Gregg Wallace causing all sorts of problems. Have they got to grips with the thorny talent issues? Roger Bolton of Beebwatch grasps the nettle. All that plus, why is Europe doing more business with the UK? Media writer Maggie Brown tells us more, and in the media quiz we cover another turbulent week in newsrooms. That's all happening in this edition of the Media Club. Come on in. So welcome back to the Media Club. Before we get into the big stories of the week, I'd like to ask our guests who they would like to induct into our numbers. Roger, who would you like to add?
Well, I'd like to add Danny Finkelstein. Apart from writing the most brilliant book about his family, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, he writes this fantastic column in the Times. And this week he said, money has just begun its ascent to the political throne, and we may not be able to stop it. And what he's talking about there is, of course, the story that Elon Musk is going to give $100 million, allegedly, to Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. That will be allowed under present law.
Through Twitter, through X, its UK subsidiary.
Yeah, because he's paying through X. And the other thing, of course, was that if he was trying to plough this money into broadcast, he wouldn't get anywhere. He wouldn't be allowed to. But on social media, he can do what he likes. So Danny's always been very perceptive about changes that are going to come, and it's a big warning sign. So I'd elevate him. Okay,
well, he's very welcome. And the book is...
his book is Hitler and Stalin, Mum and Dad. And basically the story is that during the Second World War, his Jewish antecedents, one ended up being imprisoned by Stalin and the other ended up effectively being almost wiped out by Hitler. But the two stories in parallel are remarkable. And what it does illustrate, my generation was brought up thinking in the 60s progress was inevitable. Wars wouldn't happen again. It's all the past. You read that, Danny's book, you realise history may be circular, so be careful.
Yes, it does rhyme. And Maggie, talking about books, we've had your book behind you on display for the last few months.
Goodness me,
I hope it's generated at least a couple of sales, sales at Amazon.
It's been put on an international sales website by publishers, Bloomsbury. So I await to get some maybe minuscule
residuals
at some point. Yes.
Did you get an advance?
Yes, I did. I got two
congratulations
for both of them.
That's good. That's good.
Yes, I got decent, and also Channel 4 had to chip in a bit because the second book went on for so long because there was no resolution about what was going to happen to it. So yeah, I'm not complaining.
That's nice. And who would you like to add to our club roles this week?
Well, I know it sounds odd, but I was thinking, and this isn't really very media-ish, I know, about Damian Lewis, because I so enjoyed him as Henry VIII this last Sunday, and I kind of couldn't believe really that this man was sort of picking up a tiny baby at one point and then, plotting to cut off someone's head. But last night I had the great pleasure to turn on Newsnight. Victoria Derbyshire was there, of course. She was interviewing over Gregg Wallace, in fact, Shannon Kyle, who has made a big splash in the papers as well today. But I hadn't read the papers. I listened to this interview, and I thought, although I think the story has been overblown and it shouldn't have been on so many front pages, I thought she did a terrific job. But I also thought that Shannon Kyle, speaking out so clearly, she is a writer and an author, and she can put words together well.
So she was
I think she's done the business.
She had ghostwritten Gregg Wallace's
that's right.
book.
And,
but she also signed a non-disclosure agreement. And I must say, I may be getting old and peppery, but I think if people people shouldn't sign non-disclosure agreements. If they do, they should probably stick to them. Why do they sign them and then subsequently, come out and tell you what the truth is? If they didn't sign them and they told people immediately what had happened and they'd complained about it, a lot of these problems would be stopped early on.
But isn't the push that you have to sign the non-disclosure agreement to get any of the work? You don't really have a choice whether you sign it or not.
Well, you have a choice, in which case you say, I'm not doing it.
I think her point was also that at the point she did these extensive interviews to do this book, she was actually pretty broke. And she's in currently a stronger position. I know. I think she's spoken out quite far into this story, in fact, and has held herself back. Well, I don't know if she's getting paid at all for an extra fee for doing this, but I think she did the right thing.
Oh yeah.
And I would have broken a non. I don't like breaking.
But would you have signed it in the first place?
You would have had to do the book to get the work, I think.
Well, we'll add her to the club roles, and we could ask her about it if she joined us in the club. I mean, sticking with Gregg Wallace, 7 days on, Roger, how's the BBC fared with the latest talent scandal?
Well, if I try and be sympathetic to the BBC, I would say actually he doesn't work for the BBC directly. He works for independent companies, always has. He worked for Channel 5 as well. And this is the real problem, that when you are, you're the publisher, which the BBC is, so you have responsibility, but you're not actually in charge of the production. And you rely upon executive producers, independent companies, to basically look out for this sort of thing. On the other hand, in the industry we are at the moment, where lots of people are unemployed, where independent companies are desperate to survive, and if they know a star is wanted, they're not going to actually tell the star off or whatever. So you've got a fundamental imbalance of power there. And if you're a young researcher or a runner on a 3-month contract, do you think you're going to stand up? So it's a really difficult situation.
This has happened for every one of these that pops up. We talk about the same thing, don't we? In that talent are allowed to get away with it, and there's always like rumours of we're going to change this scenario. We're going to be much tougher with it. It never happens.
It never happens. And the problem we see, some problems you could spot. I mean, Gregg Wallace is a very talented man from a working class background, done very well to get where he is. But we've got there basically on the basis of banter. Now you could see he's on the edge. What he needs is a very strong person with him at various points saying, you don't do that, Greg, you're crossing the line. If you do this, you're out. Nobody's done that. Now, whether the BBC is responsible for it, it's partly responsible, but in a sense it's inheriting a problem that's everywhere in the industry. You just always hope that this will be a turning point. But, it's going to it's not going to stop for the BBC. You've got a couple of inquiries still coming up over Russell Brand and DJ Tim Westwood. They're waiting in the wings. There will be more. What's also happened in the industry, which is very difficult, is budgets have got cut. People are still expecting the same product. Kids are working insane hours. It's very, very difficult out there. Whether that can be changed, I don't know.
Well-liked talent is a shortcut to ratings, shortcut to marketing for these shows. Are we because of the financial situation, are we in hock to talent even more?
Well, the danger is, if you're an indie and you know that there's a big star who's really wanted by... And it's the difference between getting a commission and not getting a commission. If you work with the star, you'll tend to work with the star. So I think it has to start at the top through the BBC, but they do need the cooperation of independents. I've been distressed recently to find out that somebody who was very high in the industry, operated in the top echelons, when working as an indie, was indulging talent, not listening to complaints that were coming, not mainly sexual harassment, but other things, because, it might affect the profits, might affect the company. I mean, this is an industry-wide problem. The BBC should be setting an example, but it needs everybody to work with it.
Maggie, Kirsty Walk was one of the first people to sort of well-known people to come out and talk about it. A woman of a certain age, as Gregg Wallace referred to that group. I mean, in some ways he's right. That is a group that does have maybe more power than others. As Mimir as well talked about it too. Are they going to be the ones to fix this problem?
Well, they may be. I mean, I really don't know. I mean, one of my great advantages in talking about this story is that I actually couldn't stand him as a broadcaster simply because I absolutely loathe all cooking shows, apart from Jamie Oliver. So I'm not actually a massive expert on his style because I just would not be part of that audience. Yes, it does look a bit like, as he rather sadly said, middle-aged but powerful women ganging up on him. And he is obviously outside of his time. I think he's had a really good run. I don't think he hasn't done anything which would appear to lead to any kind of judicial kind of follow-ups. If I was him, I would assume that he has a decent pension in his 60s. He clearly has another wife, I think, with relatively youngish children. If he has managed to amass a fortune, then I think he should go quietly and stop baiting the women who have, for one reason or another, been not assaulted or anything, but have been felt demeaned.
Well, there have been one or two allegations of assault, but
someone said to me that they reckon that part of his sort of surprising response was that he never watches the programmes he's in, and what he says on the sort of studio floor is not perhaps what always makes it to the show. And of course, he's never maybe picked up on this.
Well, actually, that's clearly the case, isn't it? Because, I mean, Roger's said the truth here. I mean, I know that it can be ambivalent, and it can also be the case that producers want to sort of basically foster their talent and not sort of undermine them. But I would have thought really that it's pretty clear that it's a misjudgment. It's his personality no longer really fits into the modern kind of standards of broadcasting. Roger, you're absolutely right. So much depends on the producers behind programs. You know that, I know that, everybody knows that. We also know, for in the media, we have to rely on. Well, I certainly have in my past incarnations as media editor, and goodness knows what else. You do rely on the unseen sub-editors and the editors who look at your copy, call you in and say, do you really mean that? And they save you often from misjudgments because you're under pressure. You know, you're trying to make the program, or you're trying to write the piece that you think is going to be outstanding, and you go too far.
Yeah, but there's another problem here, which is that, BBC's always being told by Ofcom and others that it's out of touch with the working class, that it doesn't do enough. Now, Gregg Wallace, you could see, was for them, here's a figure who's obviously coming from a working class background. This will work for us. And he's very talented. Not many people can do that, but actually they're all unusual. If they get to that position, they're unusual, and because they're unusual, they need to be watched by more, as it were, normal people to hold them in. But you could see the attraction.
But there's nothing wrong with having rough diamonds, if you want to call that, or people with
but he's a bit more than rough diamonds.
I mean, no, but people who can actually connect with working class people.
Well, I agree.
And I understand what the BBC's problem is, but when I sit, for example, in Wales, and I'm watching either ITV Wales or BBC Wales or whatever, or the local radio, there are plenty of people who are able to speak in dialects or in with their own accents, and it comes across perfectly well. I think he just wasn't being as it were, taken to one side and just calm down a bit, because if any of these things are true, it is a bit much, really.
But there is a resonance, One of the things I thought he was doing initially was appealing to the anti-woke, when he was making initial statements before the disastrous career-threatening statement. I thought he was trying to appeal to saying this is woke here. And you could see a number of newspapers, the Mail, the Telegraph, you could say GB News and so on and Talk, already almost ready to take his side. Because there's an easy way that, middle-class BBC, etc., etc. And then he made that statement about women of a certain age. Well, that just ended it all. That just ended it all, and so everybody descended upon him. He just needs to shut up for 3 or 4 years, develop an interest in something else, and there might be a way back. But the BBC also cannot afford to lose any of these celebrity master chef shows. The BBC is struggling for hits everywhere. It's not producing new hits. It can't afford to let this one go. So it won't.
Well, just before we move on, you mentioned it earlier. Obviously, there are other reports knocking around that have not come out. There's a Russell Brand one that's still outstanding, but the BBC, the Tim Westwood one, which I was talking to a BBC person this week who thought it was going to be out this week, and I said, I've heard this thing is going to be out over the last 6 months. I think there's going to be a lot of explosions that come from that. They're sort of similar, which is basically staff reported it. BBC didn't look into it.
Well, I don't know a lot about it in detail, but I think the difference is this. From my understanding, he's inside the BBC. This is not an independent producer for most of it. He's operating within the organisation, and therefore it ought to be easier for the organisation to stop. But you can see what's gone on there, because Tim Westwood, even though he's white, associated himself with a lot of black music, getting down with people, and the BBC, the middle-class BBC, people like myself, and I used to be, don't exactly understand a great deal of this territory. Oh, here's Tim Westwood, he understands. And they're allowed to run a bit on their own. And they're not supervised, and also we can't afford to lose this audience because we're not getting it any other way, and we're told by everybody we've got to be in touch with that audience. So you can see how it would happen, but potentially it could be more serious because he's in the building.
Well, let's keep an eye on that one. I think we might see it in the next few weeks. Next up, and TV trade body PACT revealed this week that international production revenues have risen despite a drop-off from the US. Maggie, where's all this money coming from?
Well, it's coming from broadcasters who can afford it, obviously, is the answer to that. Clearly, the initiative is with places where advertising is recovering. It doesn't seem necessarily to be the case for us in the UK. I mean, it's very welcome. There was a report just a few months ago which said that 68% of the UK independent or independently employed producers and other people in the television media, film, were basically unemployed. So if this is the case, and if it's going to spread, then I would be feeling very much more relieved for.
Yeah, but there are whole areas of being vacated. I mean, if you go along the M4, you'll see new studios. America's come here. They love to make stuff, Netflix and everything else. What has disappeared or is disappearing are all those, if you like, documentary series about British things. Home. They still happen a bit, but they're largely disappearing. History, which isn't about a well-known presenter standing in front of a building and reproducing what he's actually written in a book beforehand. Original journalism in that is disappearing. So although, if you like, the revenues may be going up in a business sense, in a creative sense, we're now having large deserts are opening up, in my view.
Channel 5, though, is, funnily enough, owned by American, is doing a lot of, if you want to know about Yorkshire, you want to know about Scotland, etc., you want to know about the Tower of London, they're doing masses of kind of quite simple but actually quite informative programmes.
On last week's show, we had Stephen D. Wright, the producer, and he was saying there's this big gap in the middle. So it works very well on the reality end. It's relatively inexpensive to make. It's very good on the premium end, which we do a very good job on, Crown style stuff. But things in the middle is where we've lost a lot of activity because broadcasters can't necessarily sell that abroad, and the hits that they want need to be at one end of that scale.
But this is what public service broadcasting should be in part about, to identify what the market can do and to identify what the market can't do. What I desperately hope over the next 2 years, when we're moving to the BBC Charter and the suggestion of the licence fee or its replacement, is we don't start with the BBC. We start with public service broadcasting because it should involve Channel 4, which Maggie knows more about than anybody else. What do we want going forward from public service broadcasting? What's the best way of delivering it? BBC, I think, probably should be in there. Then what you pay for it. But we start at the bottom end. We don't have the licence fee.
But Roger, we're having a review, aren't we? There is a review that is going to take place about exactly this, how you put the public service broadcasting ethos and mission together.
Well, allegedly, but I mean, is this going to be a deal between the BBC and the government? And
it normally is.
But what about a wider discussion?
But I think it is about that. I mean, it is about ITV is one very good example. Should it be up for sale? We don't know or not. But the other option is that there's a form of sort of cooperation, which we have seen in some areas.
But when have you heard anybody talking about, for example, with the BBC, what is the BBC arts strategy? It doesn't have one. What is Channel 4's arts strategy? I can't find it. What about the religion? What about science? What about all of those things that, on the whole, are not done by the Netflixes of this world? What do we want our children to learn? For example, about, learning about how to be very careful to identify sources of information. They can now believe almost anything as a result of the social media. What do we think the public service broadcasters can do about that? How can they work with schools? How can they work with university? We need this debate. Instead, we've got BBC under great pressure, having lost, 43% of its value over the last 15 years in terms of spending power.
Spending value, yeah.
In terms of spending value. And it's trying to create, understandably in view of the last government, a business model to make sure it survives as a big business. Meanwhile, what about public service?
But you talked there about things that the BBC should do, that or public service broadcasting should do.
Yeah. And
but is that about doing the unpopular things? Is it a market failure argument that's the role of those broadcasters?
I mean, it's partly market failure because sometimes the market delivers. But and you can't just define public service by market failure. But I think you can ask about, for example, original writers, one-off plays. Where do they start? What opportunities do they have to tell stories about their communities directly that we can involve in? And also you have that serendipity. I mean, who would have thought that? A series about detectorists made on a shoestring in East Anglia would be popular around the world. But you couldn't, and nobody's going to pretend that they anticipated that. But you have to create an environment, and we have in the past, where that sort of experiment can be done, and occasionally gold will be found, as indeed it was in the detectorists.
I'm feeling a bit more optimistic than you, because I think
You always have been.
I'm still alive. But I think that we have had, this time last year, with the Conservatives still in, do you remember there was an expected rise in the licence fee, and then the amount that was due was cut, so it was a great disappointment.
Well, it's frozen for 2 years, and
but they're putting another, yes, exactly, but they're putting another £5 apparently on the licence fee this year, and we have a very sympathetic Culture Secretary for the first time for ages about, in public service broadcasting. And we also have somebody who's a chair of the BBC that isn't...
but Maggie, no government is going to increase substantially the licence fee. It ain't going to happen.
No,
so
but we're talking about the role of public service broadcasting, and I would have thought there's some reason to be optimistic as everybody looks around and sees what countries and nations and parts of the world do when they don't have a media that can address the whole country in a way that is trusted. There is a real role for public service.
Well, I believe that.
And they can find it. I'm absolutely convinced. I'm not a negative person like you. I'm surprised, Roger, really.
I'm trying to be positive.
Can I ask a question about that? So is Maggie right? We're in a better government position for discussing the future of broadcasting than we would have been 2 years ago.
We are. I mean,
you've got a big changes with what happens with ITV. Does it remain a UK company or not? Is there any public? What's the desire around Channel 4 making its own programmes? What was it got to do? It's been renewed. It's had its licence renewed. Are we actually in a place where we can have that discussion?
Well, I think we can have the discussion. It's quite clear that the Conservative Party would have liked to have got rid of the BBC, and they knew they couldn't. They'd like to get rid of the licence fee. They knew they couldn't in the short term because all the alternatives won't work, at least for the moment. So what they did was squeeze it, and they really did squeeze it. And there are very few people in the Conservative government who would be sympathetic to the idea of an intervention in that way. Well, that's changed, but also we're in such a dreadful economic situation where we'll need to spend more on defence because of Putin. We've got real problems in the health service and education and so on. The idea that there's been a massive increase in the licence fee is for the birds. But what we have to do now, and there has to be a debate to convince people that public service is worth having, and identify those areas collectively that we want. One of my criticisms of the BBC, though I understand it, is in making the necessary cuts that it has to make in terms of money, it hasn't consulted the public about what should be cut. Now, its argument would be once we start the consultation, it would never end. Yeah. But you look at, for example, the World Service. BBC now has one correspondent in China. It's pulled out its correspondent from Taiwan. It's got massive numbers and increasing numbers of news people in America because it thinks it can make money in America.
But will £30 million of new money from the government for the World Service help arrest that?
It will help, but it will only slow down what's been happening. I mean, we hopefully, and I think there are probably enough Tories to support this as well, we may well get to a situation where the World Service isn't funded separately again, and where there's a proper discussion about where we should be. The other thing you've got to remember is the more you invest, say, in America or like in Westminster, the more stories appear on screen and on air because you invested people. If you only have one person in China, and also they're stuck in Beijing, you ain't going to get stories out of arguably the world's most important country.
But Roger, we're going to have two select committees, one on foreign affairs and one on culture, actually looking at this problem. It isn't as bad as you think. I know the amount of money you're talking about is small, but the fact is that the mood has changed. The wind has changed direction.
I agree,
and I actually think it could be a whole lot worse. Of course, the World Service has to have a reinforcement of its role. So does news and current affairs, and so does the other public service broadcasting areas. And I have to say as well, I am very impressed by some of the attempts that ITV has made to make programming, including, obviously, we know one of them, the post office.
Mr. Bates and the post office,
yes,
yeah.
But it goes on commissioning interesting programming, dramas, and it also, I can say this because I've been watching a lot of it in Wales, it does cover areas outside of England, outside of London, I think pretty well.
Yeah,
in difficult conditions.
It is, but
okay, I'm going to stop you there.
That's right.
Thank you both. There's more to have of this discussion, particularly over the next 12 months. Maggie, stay with us. In a moment, we'll be joined by Fenton Bailey for a deep dive into 90s TV, Drag Race and more after these messages. What do the new Gladiator movie and the Media Club have in common? Well, they're both filmed with beautiful 4K cameras. While I won't compare myself to Paul Mescal, thanks to Podshop Studios, we bring you that same cinematic quality every episode, giving our listeners the best video experience. So if you're looking for a space to elevate your podcast production and your video podcast content, Podshop Studios is a state-of-the-art podcast studio right in the heart of central London. With expert engineers and industry-leading equipment, they guarantee high-quality recordings every time. Whether you're just starting your podcast journey or a seasoned pros like us, Podshop is the ideal place for recording content that stands out from the crowd. So you can focus on the talking and leave the rest to the experts. Plus, for a limited time only, you can get 25% off your first booking if you use the code Media Club for your booking here at Podshop Studios. Don't miss out. Head to their studio page at podshoponline.co.uk. That's podshoponline.co.uk and take your podcast to the next level. Welcome back. And in the Media Club this week, we had some drinks for our club members. So this isn't part of the artifice. This was true things that they were talking about. Cheers all round for a recommissioned Disney Plus series, Rivals. It's incredibly UK premise, appearing to have no issue for international audiences. Or does it just have a soft spot with commissioners? Maybe the algorithm has been muted in this occasion. Gregg Wallace's behaviour appears to have been no surprise to readers of Pop Bitch. The question now is whether anyone at the BBC or the production company had a look through their archives, perhaps worth a scroll. And Fraser Nelson, fresh from getting the chop as the Spectator editor under the new regime, has been fronting a documentary for Channel 4 on disability and benefits. Is he making a break for television? Maggie, it was pretty well received, Fraser Nelson's documentary.
Yes, it was. It was very good. And yes, I think he is making a definite case that he could be either a broadcaster or he could be something in television, which of course, having come from the Spectator, he has in a way been practicing for that, because he has been on a lot of television discussions and generally being able to be the kind of you might say right of centre, but sensible balance to, and he has a nice voice as well. I think it does matter that. I think he's easy to listen to, and he's charming without being aggressive to anybody. I think he would be very good on television, actually.
Well, we've swapped out Roger for Fenton Bailey, co-founder of World of Wonder. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. It's interesting, your background, very documentary-based. Mm-hmm. When new people come into this space, are you always watching to see what their take is, or can they manage it, or are they just a face?
There used to be very clear boundaries between TV and radio. And interestingly, I think podcasts end up being this sort of middle space where you can be filming the podcast as well as doing audio. I think this is filmed as well as being audio. And so I think those sort of hard and fast boundaries are merging. And so people end up doing more than one thing and often end up doing multiple different things. Funnily enough, we did a series, Catch and Kill, with Ronan Farrow for HBO that was based on his best-selling book about the Harvey Weinstein story, but based on the podcast he made about writing the book. And we then turned the podcast into a TV series. So, all those versions can coexist. And I think that's the sort of space we're in these days.
Very enterprising of you.
You're normally in LA, so it's great that you're here in London. You've been here for Content London. How have you found that?
Content London was interesting because I sort of have a feeling that the sort of real screen and TV conferences, industry conferences in the past have been more vital than this felt. And the question I was asked was, how do I feel about the state of unscripted? Is it really as bad as it seems? And I realized, looking around the modest audience, that maybe it is actually pretty bad, because maybe, the audience has just passed it by, and that a lot of traditional media hasn't perhaps woken up to the way social media has come along, because there's no question we're all watching so much more than ever before. We just may not be watching linear TV. We may not even be watching streaming. We may be watching, YouTube videos and TikTok videos and Instagram. And I'm not saying they're good or bad, but I think that the fact of the matter is, media has changed seismically and rapidly, and is going to continue to change even more.
Well, you're a Brit in America with lots of international production, obviously particularly Drag Race all around the world. it's hurting here in the UK with TV production at the moment, particularly in certain genres. Do you see that replicated elsewhere? Do you think it's just something that's happening here? What's your kind of global take?
It's the sort of end of times. And you had the writer's strike. You have massive layoffs at Disney, at Paramount, at all the big ones. You've got enormous consolidation, and as a result of that, redundancies. It's pretty bleak and dire, and a lot of freelancers in the States are out of work, not just on the scripted side, but the unscripted side too. Yeah.
For your organisation, kind of a mixture of things. You've obviously documentary production, drag race, and other entertainment shows. You've got an event coming up with RuPaul DragCon in London. Right. There's a streaming service that sits alongside this. Are you doing that because it's sort of fun? Are you doing that because it's important to diversify, because of the market's changing? Why all of those elements?
I think all of the above. I mean, honestly, we do love what we do, and I couldn't imagine doing what we do if we didn't love it. And I actually think it's very hard to do it if you don't. And there's certainly not a financial imperative to do it. If you want to make money, be a banker. I don't think that the money is in TV the way perhaps it was back in the 80s, And I think it's part of this change that we're seeing, that I believe everyone today really is a creator, is a producer, is a director, is an actor. My son, he's about to turn 18, and he wants to go to film school. When I applied to film school, I had never made a film in my life. He has to make 3 films to submit, and he showed them to me, and they're extraordinary. I mean, of course, I'm a proud dad, so I'm biased,
so
clearly, yes. But I was amazed at how they were shot, how they were edited. Just kids today really know what they're doing.
How long would a film of his be? I mean, how many minutes?
These are like 3 to 5 minute pieces. But I think to tell a story in 5 minutes is a skill set too. You've got to have the beginning, the middle, and the end.
We've got a new Drag Race UK winner in Kyron. I mean, the drag artists, they're sort of content creators themselves.
Absolutely. No, I think drag artists are the sort of... I look at them as pop stars of the 70s or 80s, the kind of iconic figures that I grew up looking up to, and that they're so capable in so many ways, not just fashion and a look, or singing or lip syncing or dancing or moving, but also in terms of getting their audience and serving their audience via social media. They're very adept at creating their own following and cultivating that following.
Do you think that that's the future, though, that there will come about different kind of ideas and formats that will drag people in again? Seems to me we have a massive choice at the moment, and I to be fair, I'm a great supporter, as you probably know, of public service broadcasting, but I actually really quite enjoy the changes that have taken place, because I love the streamers, so especially Netflix, and indeed ITVX I think is doing very well. So I can cut out quite a lot of the middle stuff that I don't really want to know. I will watch the things I really do still on ITV, BBC, Channel 5, whatever, Channel 4 decreasingly. And I think that I know I should be thinking, which is true, that our main British-owned channels are underpowered now. Nonetheless, I feel I can fill the gaps with some of these other streamed services. So I can't say I'm disappointed. And I also like the choice of foreign news. This is the other thing. I spend an awful lot of time not on the BBC or even, although I actually think Sky News is very good, but I'm certainly up there for Al Jazeera and all sorts of other things. Well,
Fenton, you've got your own streaming service in Wow Presents Plus. That's right, isn't it?
That's right.
And that obviously picks up a lot of shows that you're making for other people. And I suppose, is it a complex rights juggle to decide who gets to see what?
It is a little bit, but essentially, I wanted to pick up on what Maggie's saying, because I think it relates to that. Really, the way to answer this is the same thing. That I think back to when, listening to the radio, you'd wait for hours for your favorite song, or then once a week sit down to watch Top of the Pops. What's changed is now you can have an iPod or you can have Spotify, and anything you want you can have whenever you want, which sounds great and amazing, but actually sometimes not having the choice was really good. And you are now free, Maggie, to seek out what specially interests you, and as you say, forget the middle. And one of the things that they've discovered in this massive consolidation exercise in the States, you've got HBO, CNN, Discovery, they're all in this massive company. They had the whole argument was, well, we will now have a lake of content of makeover programming, HGTV, homes, gardening. No one wants to watch it. Yes.
Yeah.
No one wants to. And everyone's like, they kind of have undermined the HBO brand and sort of sidelined it, kind of like diminished it. Yet that was what people loved, that premium feel. And you've got Max, and no one really, what is Max? It just feels like a little bit of everything. And in a way, the fact that it is so massive and has so much, it's slightly off-putting. Whereas something like, Mubi, suddenly, which is like, oh yes, I feel like I'm Mubi. It's a curated, essentially art house movies. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go to Mubi. Or hopefully, Represents Plus, where you can watch Drag Race.
That's exactly what I experience when I go and stay in California with my daughter and her American husband and the children. I mean, they actually like things because they like Stephen Saka on the World Service, and they're really worried that he's going to finish, which I think he is. And they cherry pick things, but they watch a lot of movies as well because that actually is a contained period of time, and you can choose it. So. But when they come to the UK, they love the BBC too.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of.
You know what though? It's about all things. I think we always seem to think, oh well, the new thing is here. Everything's going to be streaming. It's about massive streamers. It's actually not. Linear is enjoying a sort of moment of revival and fast channels, and I think we're ultimately emerging into a world which may sound unpleasant to some, but in which it's all these different kind of models have a role to play. And in fact, each one modifies the other one. It's not like they're out to put each other out of business.
I was looking at some of the content on WoW, and obviously there's some sort of tentpole content. There's all the kind of spin-off shows and things that talk about the shows and things that are probably not quite podcasty, but they take a sort of a podcast feeling. I mean, how do you schedule that or kind of commission for that? Is it weird to go from someone that pitches to the networks now like, hey, what should we pay for our own service, for our own users?
Well, not really, because I think the movement we've seen over the last, I'd say, a couple of years is a reluctance on the part of commissioners to commission stuff, and they're terrified of picking the wrong thing, putting the money into the wrong thing, losing their jobs, understandably, especially when there's less money to go around and there's ratings are dwindling. So I think what's evolving is much less development, much less resources for that, and much more, if you can make it somehow, some way, that's the way to go forward. Do what you want to do, make what you want to make, and maybe it's right for Netflix, but maybe it's not. And if not, it's right for WoW Presents Plus.
So you've had some obviously shows on like MTV VH1 on the logo, I guess, for Drag Race. Which is Paramount. Got to try and remember all of the things. And on the other side, so on some of the home buying shows, I guess we're Bravo, which is NBC.
Right.
And so NBC Universal are probably going to spin off a lot of their cable channels.
Yes.
You've done quite well out of cable over the years. Where do you think that's going? Do you think that's going to be good news for those
spinning
services?
off cable, but those channels that they're putting in a separate company called Spinco.
At the moment, Spinco. Yes.
But they generate 7.5 billion in revenue annually. So they're not losing money. They're just not making as much money as perhaps they would like to make.
Yeah.
No, cable's going to stay around. Linear's going to stay around. On WoW Presents Plus, funnily enough, what we do is we have behind the paywall a linear feed that just shows content from the platform so that you don't have to choose. You can log in and just watch. We also have a thing where if you want to preview the channel, you can watch every single first episode of every single version of Drag Race that there is. And if that doesn't get you, I don't know what will.
But you say your son's going into filmmaking. What are you advising him to do in this very, kind of open but yet quite complicated
Terrifying.
world? Yes,
terrifying. Do you feel pleased or guilty he wants to come into the media?
Do I feel guilty?
Pleased or guilty?
Oh, no. I'm like, go for it, because he is clearly much more talented than I was. And I told him, I said, no, don't just go to film school. Also do some other major or minor, that is actually sort of useful. Because I think ideas actually are not the scarce resource, that everyone can have an idea for a show, but it's knowing how the market works, knowing what the opportunities are. So why not do a degree in business as well, so you can at least understand how your idea might be, how you might be able to realize it. Because I think the days of being a head in the clouds director or creator with no mind to the audience or how you're going to monetize what you do, I think those days are over.
Well, I think he's very fortunate to have you as a father, actually. I think that's very good career advice.
If we go back to the beginning of World of Wonder, I guess that was 91?
Yes.
Yeah.
Last century.
So, world's changed obviously dramatically from a kind of a media acquisition perspective and what's out there. When you started that up, do you feel the same way you did back then about what you make? Has that changed?
Well, yes, it has changed, and I feel the same way, but there's no question none of this would have happened without Channel 4. Like, Channel 4 was a window of opportunity, and we were just in the right place at the right time. I mean, I was, funnily enough, working on Wall Street as a videotape editor at Drexel Burnham, like cutting together videotapes about junk bonds and stuff I knew nothing about. And but Randy and I, we loved public access and the kind of crazy shows that were on Manhattan Cable. And because I was working at Drexel Burnham, and because my friend was making a documentary about Michael Milken, and because Caroline Thompson, the commission editor, was on maternity leave, and Michael Atwell was sitting in for her, I was working on this documentary about Drexel Burnham and junk bonds. And out of that, he said to me one day, "Oh, what else have you got? Any other ideas?" I mean, and we said, actually, we do have an idea. Let's take clips from these public access shows and make a kind of collage, late night, after the pub show. And that was our first series.
And obviously Evolution sort of take over TV into Adam and Joe.
Yeah.
And that was obviously a big hit for you. What was it like working with those two at the beginning?
Oh, I love Adam and Joe. And because Michael Atwell said, look, Manhattan Cable's great, but we got to have some originated UK content. So why don't you bring the idea of public access to the UK, which was take over TV? And I was in Barrack Street, I was cutting together the pilot reel, and oh God, some of this stuff's so tedious. And I had a pile of tapes that a researcher had looked at and said these were all rejects. And it was like 2 a.m. The tape was due. I was like, I got to do something. Picked the top tape off. It said, "Much too clever for its own good." I popped it in, and it was Adam Buxton. And I was like, oh my gosh. It was just, it wasn't me. I was just like, he's brilliant and funny. And that's how that...
Well, I think you said at Content London this week, all the biggest shows are accidental.
Yes.
So those accidents can happen in lots of different ways. Maggie, do you think when you talk about Channel 4 there, has it all got a bit too safe?
I think it actually needs a big refresh, really. Channel 4, as it started, was clearly quite experimental, and it took a lot of risks. I think at the moment, one of the things about it, remember Jeremy Isaacs' point, it wasn't a job for life. You had to keep changing the commissioners, you had to keep refreshing yourself, and you had to keep asking quite difficult questions of yourself as well. And as we all know, he left after sort of 6 years, and it was handed over to Michael Grade, who actually stayed too long, for 10 years, and that was a problem, although of course it has adapted in that period to being advertising funded, which is a good thing. I mean, it is to some extent not dependent on what the government thinks about it. It is itself. I think at the moment it should actually have a refresh at the top, and I think it needs new inspiration.
Fenton, do you think we need term limits for commissioners?
I think that's not a bad idea, actually, because there's no question that there was a window of stuff where so much work we did for Channel 4, and I can't imagine how we would have ever... There's no... In America, we couldn't get anything off the ground.
It was a wonderful innovation. And this is the reason I actually gave myself this rather onerous task of writing about 40 years of, and I'm never writing another history again, I can tell you. I'm not in the market. But the reason I did it was that in the sort of the noughties, when they were changing chief executives quite quickly, Mark Thompson, for example, was one, I suddenly find myself sitting in things like press conferences, and the people in senior positions in Channel 4, not Michael, but other people, were making statements that weren't true. And I realised they didn't know the origins of their own company. And this was only 15 years out. And it was at that point I thought, somebody's got to write this down. And I had witnessed it at first hand almost, in my own little lowly role, first of all at The Guardian and then at the independent newspaper. And I loved every aspect of it for its getting up and go kind of. And I love the films, of course.
Have you got
great. So that was why I thought it had to be set down and recorded so that only a few probably boring, will find me very boring, but I do think that...
No, I think it was a unique experiment.
Yes.
And experiment sounds condescending. I don't mean that at all. I think it was a fantastic thing that happened. And there was so much innovation that has rippled out into the industry. And it would be so great if there was
I think
still
it needs a
something
refresh. I think it really does need a refresh and maybe a rethink, really. I'm glad they're still making films. I don't know what you think about that. I think it's a good idea. But they have put it back together again with drama. There's a lot that you can do with Channel 4. Of course, it's been hit by the fact advertising is down. But that doesn't mean that you can't still think of or take up new ideas and new challenges.
Well, because ideas don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money.
No.
And I think that, Drag Race...
You just explained that yourself.
Yeah, it's and especially one of the biggest changes has been iPhones, because the quality of camera that we all have access to is far ahead of the broadcast quality cameras we had back in the day.
Just before we jump into the quiz,
quiz.
We were talking about documentaries and things you're thinking about or working on. With obviously all the things we've been seeing in the news about what's happening in the church, is there some stories there that should be covered?
Well, absolutely. I mean, thanks to Channel 4 again, we made The Eyes of Tammy Faye. They didn't fully fund it. They put some money into it, and the movie version of that documentary went on to win 2 Oscars. So, thanks to Channel 4. But there's one story actually in particular I've been following prior to the Archbishop of Canterbury's resignation, which is John Smythe. I read this book a few years ago called Bleeding for Jesus, and my jaw hit the floor. The story of John Smythe and his decades-long spree of unbridled sadism and its cover-up is extraordinary. And it's funnily enough, because I'm quite old, it's a world I know because I was at boarding school in the 70s. I had friends who were at Winchester who knew John Smythe, who went to lunch at his house, who looked at the garden shed, but who didn't, who weren't abused by him.
Were they beaten at school?
No, but we were sort of part of the, I was part of at boarding school, I was in the sort of evangelical thing, because you were away from home, you were sort of, you were lonely, and these were sort of slightly Spartan atmospheres. And so the evangelical thing, the prayer groups and the holding hands, it offered some kind of companionship. But I personally was never invited to UN camps, and having read Andrew Grayston's wonderful book, Bleeding for Jesus, I understand why. They had a phrase, not quite what we want. And I was obviously, gay as they come. And I don't think I was quite what they wanted.
So
exactly.
Are you keen to turn into a doc, or is that in development?
I would love to do it I think it's an extraordinary story. I think it's a very dramatic story, but I also think it's a story about social history. John Smythe made a name going after gay news as Mary Whitehouse's barrister when she sued it for blasphemy, successfully sued it for that poem of the centurion looking up at Jesus on the cross and having this fantasy. And the sort of consummate irony of that poem is that John Smythe, who condemned it and who saw the demise of gay news and won the conviction, was that poem perfectly describes him. And it's just so ironic that this twisted, sick individual would be able to so hypocritically persecute gay people who just wanted to express themselves and live their lives out loud, as it were, while he perpetrated this awful, damaging, I don't even know how to finish that. He just committed so much harm in kind of hiding in plain sight. And when he was found out...
Yeah, very much in plain sight.
Yeah, and when he was found out, no consequences. Just well, let's get him off to Africa, which is also another appalling kind of idea, where, of course, he just set up and started doing the whole thing.
His own,
well, very worthy of more coverage. So let's see what happens next. Okay, time for the quiz. Let's see how much you've been paying attention to the media news this week. And this week it's entitled Press Gang, but Plots in 2024. So keeping this 90s theme going that we touched on earlier, we're going to give you 3 press stories of the week, but through the prism of Julia Sawala and Dexter Fletcher's show from the 90s Press Gang. Best of 3, so buzz in if you know the answer. So your names are buzzers. So Maggie, you will say...
Maggie.
And Fenton, you will say...
Okay. Fenton, yes, all right.
Brilliant. Let's play...
Fingers on the buzzer.
Press Gang with plots, but in 2024. Right, here we go. The editor of the Junior Gazette, Linda Day, refuses to back down in the face of a revolt from reporters led by Spike. So who in the news this week has had to facing a revolt from reporters?
Oh, the Guardian. Maggie.
Observer.
Maggie.
So, Maggie, yes, let's go with you.
Oh, The Guardian, I said.
The Guardian, yes. Guardian Observer journalists have had a 2-day strike. Mm-hmm. It's your old place.
Yes, indeed.
Would you have been on the picket line?
Probably not. Although I do feel sorry because the Observer deserves better, really, than being treated in this way by The Guardian. They've always been in an unhappy relationship, and it has had very little investment, and I'm glad that the Guardian journalists are sticking up for them, and it's partly to do with the fact that they are trying to preserve their quite lucky position of not being able to be made redundant, which is a big thing. And the Guardian, when I was there, always used to let, believe it or not, the journalists decide the division of pay rises so that people could, and they always voted for equal pay for whoever you were. So the margins between people got reduced.
Fenton, would you let your staff choose the pay rises for the team?
Oh, no. There are no pay rises.
Point 1 to Maggie. Right, question number 2. Junior Gazette staff dive into a media storm when a green energy tycoon expresses interest in purchasing the student newspaper. It's another Observer story.
He says.
This is Dale Vince, OBE, who's done very well launching a green energy company, looking to be a potential owner of the Observer. So sticking on that, Observer might be sold to Tortoise. Other people are coming out of the woodwork as well. Fenton, do you think it would have a nice new lease of life by living somewhere else?
Well, it's quite possible, isn't it? And if you've said it hasn't really received much investment and it's been sort of treated in a poor way, maybe that would give it a new lease of life.
If it got the right owner. I'm not at all sure that Tortoise is the right... well, I don't think that it's a particularly healthy business in terms of making money. In fact, it seems to be losing money. And if there is to be a new owner, then I think the criteria has to be quite high. The Observer has not had really any investment you can speak of, and it hasn't really refreshed its staff at all. If you read it, it's trying really hard now, and it does have things people like, including the food monthly. So it needs it does need deep pockets, but it actually needs somebody who's committed to making it, refreshing it, and making it work. And I'm sure it can be done. Vision's
important, Fenton. Do you think that's the successful media companies, the ones that really do have the strong vision for the future?
Well, I suppose print itself is a delivery technology, and delivery technologies always change. It's funny, isn't it? Because I don't know what the solution is for newspapers and how you keep them working financially. But, one of the things that's interesting is books, for example. The Atlantic just did a thing about students just can't read books or don't want to read books. And yet, I also see, similar to the way vinyls had a resurgence in the wake of CDs and digital music, that actually books are having a bit of a moment. And it's not the same as the good old days, but it's a different, more specialized thing. And so I think there's a place for all of these mediums. It's just finding that sweet spot.
Okay, question number 3. Colin Matthews lands a covert interview with the outgoing editor of a local turned national newspaper. In a poignant subplot, Linda confronts her own doubts about her leadership and whether she's truly empowering her team. Who's local turned national, change of newspaper. Maybe a clue on the table, Maggie, that you brought in?
Oh, you mean the Evening Standard? Or
Yes.
Yes,
So
it's been turned into a weekly, which I think is very good.
Not only that, and there's been
It's Maggie.
a person.
You don't get the point.
A personnel change there as well.
Yes.
You were of the personnel change?
Yes, I don't know who. I'm afraid. Look, I've been spending days in kind of Wales, freezing to death,
No
and watching
excuse.
the sheep. But I have been reading the new Weekly Standard, and I'm from the first few editions. I'm
You're sold. You're sold.
Yes, I think it's a really good idea if they can keep it up. The writing is really
well.
good.
It'd be interesting to see whether they keep it up. So Dylan Jones, who was the launch editor,
Yes.
he has stepped down from the Standard after 18 months as the editor. So some more changes there. So lots of changes in newspapers. I'm going to make that just about Maggie to win.
I think Maggie wins hands down.
I wouldn't be too disappointed on it either.
I've never won before.
Well,
you
you've
don't
never been up
understand
against
this is a significant. Let's do this again.
I'm not sure the bar was that high.
So, Fenton, when are you back to LA?
Very soon, tomorrow. Yeah.
And what's on the list of things to do as we go into the new year?
I'm going to get my outfit ready for DragCon, which is coming up January 10th and 11th. I mean,
so that's obviously a big event in London, and also there's a version in New York. It is in
LA as well.
Yeah,
but yes, it's here at the XL in London. And I think, the way Standard is going to a weekly, I was just thinking as you were talking about, the Hollywood Reporter used to be a daily, and it became a weekly, and it's incredibly vital. And similarly, I think all these, I know I sound like a broken record, but all these things, you've got to keep on your toes and be open to changing the way you do things and the form that they take. And DragCon really is a logical extension of the show, because what we're seeing is audiences are much more engaged, hopefully, and want to participate and feel some sense of ownerships in the show. They're not just sitting there watching a show. They're participating in something. It's like fan culture, participation culture. And DragCon kind of delivers on that. And then a new twist that we sort of stumbled upon almost is that actually we shoot a lot of content for WoW Presents Plus at DragCon.
Right,
we shoot shows like Cast Reunions or Painted with Raven, and we stream all the queens at DragCon, there's 150, walking the pink carpet live. We stream it live. And all these things work, and not everything works. And in fact, yes, there's spectacular failures. But I think it's a I read, when I was a student, I read Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, about the idea that change is not something that just happens and then there's a new stability, but it's an accelerating process of increasingly rapid change. And all my years doing this, that's all I see. It's just the pace of change keeps on.
You think it's getting faster and faster?
I do.
Yes,
well, thank you.
Right.
Thanks for joining us. It's been great to have you here.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you again, Maggie.
Thank you.
And thanks to Roger from earlier. And yes, we'll see you all very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for joining us as well. Remember, you can sign up to the Media Club for free. It's at themediaclub.com. If you give us your email address, we can send you a message every week with what's on the show. My name is Matt Deegan. The producer is Matt Hill. It's a Rethink audio production with podcast discovery providing video support. I'll see you next week.